Hi, friends. This is a sermon called Keepin the Clouds Away, and it is based on the 19th chapter of Luke, verses 1 to 10, which is the story of Zaccheus, Jesus, and the tree. And it is being preached at Yellowknife United Church on November the 2nd, 2025. Honestly, climbing up the sycamore tree seemed like Zaccheus' best option. Zaccheus is a tax collector. And we know from reading Luke's gospel that tax collectors are pretty much the worst. They epitomize everything that is wrong with rich people. They're widely hated for their collaboration with Rome and for their dishonesty because they work within a crooked system. Tax collectors are responsible for remitting the money owed to the Romans in advance, and then they collect it from their citizens afterwards. They don't get paid a salary as such, they just collect whatever they want, and they get to keep all the leftovers. As such, it was a pretty good system. It was pretty motivating to lie, cheat, and steal. There are a lot of tax collectors in Luke, and none of them are very well liked. We know this from our travels through the Gospels. Our tax collector from last week, Zaccheus, is his boss. He is the head guy, the most crooked of the crooked, and the lowest of the low. The lowest of the low, literally. Zaccheus is short, way too short to see over the crowd. Not that they would let him through to the front anyway, but his small stature makes it even easier for the people to pretend that they don't even see him. Everyone is here in Jericho to see Jesus. The crowd is going mad. It's Trudeau-mania, Beatlemania, Blue Jay fever. Zaccheus wants to see Jesus too, but he might as well be invisible to everyone else who's there. Everyone's giving him the cold shoulder. If Zaccheus wants to see this rabbi that everyone's calling the Messiah, he's going to have to take matters into his own hands. So he climbs a tree. A sycamore fig, actually, which is a good little tree for the tiny tax man, because the branches are quite low to the ground. There's even fruit on them. Not that he would normally eat a sycamore fig. That's poor people food. But desperate times, desperate measures, and all that. And so Zaccheus climbs high enough to see over the heads of the gathered masses, and of course, they notice. It would be like seeing Mark Zuckerberg or Jeff Bezos climbing the monkey bars. Can you imagine the Instagram posts? #gazillionaire gaff. They think they have Zaccheus all figured out. They're laughing and pointing and rolling their eyes. What a joke. The thing is that none of these people really know Zaccheus. They don't know what's on his mind that day as he opens himself up to public ridicule and scorn because he's so very desperate to catch even a glimpse of Jesus. All they know about him is his job. All they can do is list his wrongdoings. They only know the worst things about him. He's invisible to them in more ways than one, not just his height. And listen, Zaccheus knows his life hasn't been perfect. He knows he needs to change his story, but he has no earthly idea how. He's been doing things this way for such a long time that he is in way too deep to change. How does he even take a step in the right direction? He doesn't know, but something inside of him tells him that Jesus might have the answer. So he sits in his little tree and he waits, clutching a fig, the branches poking holes in his fine clothing, hopeful, excited, and scared out of his mind. Big Bird sits in his nest, equally excited, equally nervous. Today's the day, he's decided. For once and for all, he's going to make the grown-ups see the truth. Big Bird is definitely not short in stature. He's an 8-foot-tall, bright yellow bird, and his nest is so large it doesn't even fit in a tree. Big Bird lives on Sesame Street, and his best friend in the entire world is Mr. Aloysius Snuffleupagus, Snuffy. Now, perhaps they are so close because they are both so very big. Snuffy has the body of a woolly mammoth, the trunk of an anteater, and the tail of a dinosaur. And his favorite foods are cabbage and spaghetti. He loves to dance, and he gives great snuffle hugs. Unfortunately, Big Bird is the only one on Sesame Street who knows all of this because he's the only one who has ever met Snuffy. No one else can see him. They all think that Snuffy isn't real. Every time anyone gets close to meeting him, something happens, inevitably. Snuffy has to leave to go brush his fur, or babysit his little sister Alice, or go fix his enormous toaster. There have been so many near misses that nobody even believes Big Bird anymore. They just roll their eyes and they tease him, or worse, they get annoyed. And it makes him feel awful and invisible and small. And he wants so badly to change this story. But how can he do it? I grew up watching Sesame Street, and I still remember the visceral feelings of discomfort and frustration I experienced every time Snuffy exited stage left and the grown-ups missed him yet again. Between Snuffy and the Pokeroo, it really seemed like grown-ups were way stupider than children when it came to magical creatures. Snuffy is right there, and hello, he's humongous, can't you see? Now, this storyline was very deeply entrenched. The running gag of the disappearing Snuffleupagus had been continuous on Sesame Street for 14 seasons. But in 1985, the writers discovered that they had a problem. Amid growing societal awareness of child abuse that was unfolding in the background, here is a storyline in which a child character, Big Bird is written as a 6-year-old, tells grown-ups something important, and their response over and over again is, "We don't believe you." Apart from being frustrating to the young viewers, and man, was it frustrating, and damaging to Big Bird's self-esteem, we could see, the penny finally dropped that this narrative was actually quite dangerous. Because what would happen if Big Bird, or the countless children that he represented, had a really serious issue and was afraid to tell a grown-up that was close to them for fear that they wouldn't be believed? The invisible Snuffy was supposed to be a harmless joke, but in 1985, the Sesame Street team realized that it wasn't harmless at all. They had a problem on their hands, and they had to change the plot. But how? After 14 years, the plot is entrenched. It's very hard to find a way out. Whether you're a tiny tax collector or a giant yellow bird or just a regular in-between human, we have all been stuck in narratives that we think we cannot change. Maybe it's a bad habit, or a soul-sucking job, or a failing relationship, spiraling finances, an eating disorder, an addiction, feeling trapped in the closet, masking neurodivergence, or just being scared to admit you've changed your mind about something. Every single one of us at some point in our lives has been up Zaccheus' tree. Every single one of us has sat around that Sesame Street writer's table. They're the now what moments, those times when we know that something is deeply wrong, but we don't feel brave enough to do an about-face and change course. We've also sat in Big Bird's nest, convinced that everyone believes the worst of us, that no one knows the truth. For we do live in an age of ideological entrenchment. Like the crowd with Zaccheus, we are certain that we know good from bad. And if we don't even believe ourselves capable of transformation, we are even less convinced that our adversaries could ever change. And our certainty about this gets reinforced on our social media feeds and in our echo chambers of political rhetoric: good versus bad, liberal, Bible thumper, bleeding heart, fascist, woke. There are no shades of gray. There are no room for insights. And we are all afraid to admit that sometimes we do get it wrong. And our fear leads us to dig our heels in deeper and deeper, doubling down on storylines that no longer serve us well, because we are convinced that we cannot rewrite them. And those parts of us that might have been open to change, the vulnerable parts, the parts where empathy lives, they become harder to see than a Snuffleupagus. Zaccheus' narrative is firmly entrenched. He is a tax collector, and tax collectors are the enemy, and they don't get any grace. Except that if you read Luke's gospel from end to end, they actually do. Following the arc of the whole gospel, you will notice a very gradual shift towards redemption when it comes to tax collectors. It starts way back with Jesus including the tax collectors at his table, inviting them to dine with him, in spite of the fact that the Pharisees were making fun of him for it, in spite of the fact that they were hated, perhaps because they were hated. Last week, we remember that Jesus lifted the humble tax collector up over the righteous Pharisee because he had shown repentance. And today, finally, our little friend Zaccheus spots Jesus through the branches, and somehow, unbelievably, Jesus is headed straight for him. Zaccheus, he calls out, "Come down, for I must stay at your house today." Now, if the crowd weren't upset before, they are really mad now, because someone important like Jesus lends great honor to whatever household he chooses for his meal. And no one else thinks that Zaccheus is worthy of this kind of respect. But in Zaccheus, Jesus sees something that the others do not. Zaccheus needs to rewrite his story, and so Jesus calls him to come down because he sees a human being, a person in pain who is badly in need of relationship, badly in need of redemption, badly in need of grace. Zaccheus, come down. The whole gospel could be told in this one command. And if you look carefully, you realize that Jesus doesn't tell Zaccheus to get his act together before he comes down from the tree. He doesn't say, "Zaccheus, once you've paid your debts and fixed your reputation, maybe I'll stop by." He doesn't make it conditional because grace isn't conditional, and grace turns everything upside down. Everyone else looks down at Zaccheus, but Jesus looks up at him. Everyone else sees the crook, and Jesus sees the child of Abraham. And Zaccheus hurries down, and he's overjoyed, and he's so overwhelmed by being seen, really seen, maybe for the first time in his adult life. And suddenly, it's so easy to change the story. "Half my possessions I give to the poor," he blurts out, "and if I have defrauded anyone, I will pay back 4 times as much." From the branches of the sycamore to the giant bird's nest, grace is found. Big Bird devises a plan to get the grown-ups to see Snuffy for once and for all, and he enlists Elmo to help hang onto his trunk and not let him go until they arrive. And finally, after so many misfires and so many years, the big reveal happens. And for the first time in 14 years, all of the grown-ups of Sesame Street stand with their mouths agape, staring into the beautiful, long-lashed eyes of Mr. Aloysius Snuffleupagus. They see Snuffy for the first time, and they see their mistake. They see how wrong they've been. And one by one, they apologize to Big Bird for not believing him. They apologize for laughing. They promise to listen. And for the first time, Big Bird doesn't have to carry the truth all by himself. Talk about turning things upside down. I remember watching that episode as a 5-year-old child and seeing these powerful grown-ups apologizing to my friend Big Bird. It was a tender reversal. And the thing is that the writers didn't have to include that apology. They could have just simply made Snuffy real and moved on, writing in a different way, but they understood something holy about that moment of transformation. The story doesn't change until somebody chooses to be humble. The story changes when someone dares to say, "I was wrong." And that's exactly what happens when Jesus looks up at Zaccheus, and when Zaccheus looks down and decides to climb into his new life. The entrenched story, the "this is just how things are" narrative, gets rewritten in real time, and God sees Zaccheus that day, sees him for what he truly is, not for the worst things that people say about him. And God sees us too. The grace that Jesus extends to the tiny tax collector, the grace that is exchanged between the grown-ups and the giant yellow bird, that grace belongs to us. It is made possible by God's great love for us, because God never writes us off and never believes us to be incapable of doing something different. And so we have to ask ourselves today, what do we need to come down from the tree? What storyline are we clinging to that we are too afraid to let go? Who have we refused to believe because it was easier to laugh than listen? By the grace of God, we learn it's never too late to change the story. And the same voice that called Zaccheus still calls to us. God calls our names, and leads us to courageous change, from hopelessness to promise, from dismissal to dignity, because that's what grace does. Grace looks up instead of down, and grace rewrites the story. And when grace comes to town, whether in Jericho or on Sesame Street, we know that sunny days must lie ahead. Amen.